She arrived on a Tuesday carrying a canvas tote bag and a thermos of black coffee, wearing scrubs that looked one size too big and shoes that had clearly walked 1,000 miles before reaching Mercy General. No one knew her name for the first 2 days. The charge nurse, Diane, called her the quiet one. The other nurses called her worse things behind the break room door: mousy, plain, forgettable. She smiled at every patient, moved through every shift without complaint, and said almost nothing unless she had something worth saying. Her name was Clara, and nobody thought to ask. The unit was brutal in the way teaching hospitals often are: competitive, loud, hierarchical. The senior nurses wore their experience like armor, and they had little patience for someone who didn't announce herself. When Clara corrected a medication dosage on her 3rd day, politely and precisely, the attending physician looked at her as though she had grown wings. Diane told her afterward, quietly but unmistakably, to stay in her lane. Clara nodded, refilled her thermos, and went back to her patients. She was assigned the difficult ones: the non-compliant, the grieving, the frightened. Somehow the hospital always did that with the new nurses, buried them in the hardest cases to see if they'd break. Clara didn't break. An elderly veteran named Harold, who had refused to eat for 6 days and growled at every staff member who entered his room, ate an entire bowl of soup on Clara's 2nd visit. Nobody saw what she said to him. Whatever it was, it worked. The mocking continued. A nurse named Priya started referring to Clara as the ghost because she moved so quietly through the halls. It earned laughs. Clara overheard it once, paused for just a breath, and kept walking. It was a Thursday afternoon when everything shifted. A man was wheeled in on a gurney, unconscious, bleeding from 2 places the paramedics hadn't fully controlled. He was enormous, broad-shouldered, built like someone who had spent years carrying weight most people would never lift. His vitals were crashing. The ER was stretched thin, a multi-vehicle accident having consumed every available physician. The trauma team was 3 minutes out. 3 minutes in that room was a very long time. Clara was the first nurse to reach him. She didn't hesitate. She assessed him the way someone assesses a problem they have solved before, quickly, without drama, without wasted motion. She called out exactly what she needed, by name, by measurement, by sequence. Her voice, quiet all these weeks, rang through the room with a clarity that made everyone stop. She identified a tension pneumothorax that the paramedics had missed. She knew the intervention, performed a needle decompression with hands that didn't shake, and had him stabilized before the trauma team pushed through the doors. The lead trauma surgeon, Dr. Elias Voss, looked at the monitors, looked at the patient, and then looked at Clara. "Who did this?" he asked. She raised her hand slightly, like a student in the back of a classroom. He stared at her for a long moment. "Good work," he said, which was for Elias Voss practically a standing ovation. 2 days later, 3 men arrived in the hospital in civilian clothes that somehow still looked like uniforms. They moved through the halls with a quiet authority that parted people instinctively. They were asking for the nurse who had saved their teammate. They were Navy, and the man in the trauma bay, the one who was now breathing steadily in room 14, was a SEAL combat medic, one of their own. They found Clara at the nurses' station, updating a chart. The tallest one introduced himself and said they wanted to thank her. She looked up, shook each hand, and said simply that she was glad he was going to be okay. One of them asked how she had known what to do, how she had been so certain. She set down her pen. She told them that before nursing school, before Mercy General, before all of this, she had spent 8 years as a combat medic herself, 2 deployments. One of them in a forward operating base with no surgeon and too many casualties and no margin for hesitation. She had learned, she said, that calm was a skill. That quiet was not the same as small. Diane was standing at the end of the hallway. Priya was near the supply closet. They both heard every word. The SEAL in room 14 recovered fully. He asked to meet the nurse before he was discharged. Clara sat beside his bed for 20 minutes. They talked the way people talk when they have seen the same impossible things and somehow found their way through. When she stood to leave, he said he owed her his life. She told him that was too heavy a thing to carry. and that she preferred he just live it well. She walked back to her shift, refilled her thermos, and checked on Harold, who had asked for 2 bowls of soup that morning and was, for the first time in weeks, laughing. Nobody called her the ghost after that. Diane learned her name. Priya apologized sincerely in the break room, and Clara accepted it without theater or triumph. She had never needed the recognition to do the work. She had only ever needed the work. Some people announce themselves with noise. Clara had always known that the ones who matter most arrive quietly and stay.